So we're up to this um section often Zion Chakira Zion, I think, Vav, the sixth way. Chakira philosophy. It's how to perceive Hashem or accomplish Emunah through a philosophical inquiry. But before we start this discussion, I want to note that the author of the sefer we are studying, which is called Otzros HaMosar, was nifted this past week. He was still doing Shiva for the author. His name was Moshe Tzuriel Zatzal. He was my mashgiach in Sha'alvim when I was in Sha'alvim in the 1980s and 1970s to 80s. And he was an extraordinary Talmid Chacham who wrote many Sfarim, dozens and dozens of Sfarim, and his knowledge was unbelievable. His thinking was very deep, and he had a very powerful influence on me and my inclination towards certain forms of machshava. And I even kept up a little bit of correspondence with him for several years after I left Sha'alvim. So there's a tremendous chus in his teaching and in his Sfarim. And it's a great loss for Klal Yisrael that he was nifted this past week. And our learning, of course, should be for an Ilui Neshama for Moshe Ychiel Tzuriel Zatzal. And here he's speaking about the achieving Emunah through Chakira philosophies to philosophical inquiry. And he says, jumping right in, Rabbeinu HaKadmonim, Asku Rabos B'shitazu. Our ancient rabbis, they had a lot of involvement in philosophy. Tchias Emunah Deus, Tchias Chavavavos, Emunah Deus, which is the sefer by Rabbi Sadigon, Chavas Avavos, which is of course one of the most famous Muslim of all time. Cher Rambam Bar Nevuchim, Bakdam Shlifnei Chelek Beis B'Sifro, in the introduction for the second part of Bar Nevuchim. Bar Nevuchim is 3 parts. He brought 26 introductions, meaning principles from ancient philosophy from which you can derive Emunah. We're not going to summarize what they said here. People in our generation are not used to philosophical forms of inquiry. There's a sefer about a Kodesh Baruch Hu from a later source called Or Hashem by Reb Chasdei Kreskas, which I once relatively recently, within the last couple of years, I tried starting to learn, and it was extremely tedious and uninteresting and difficult to understand because everything was based on philosophy, which is a way which we're not taught to think nowadays, and most of us don't think. Even what's called philosophy today is not the same philosophy which the ancient Greeks had, the classic philosophy of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. So we don't think that way. Most are not capable of the clarity of thought, which is necessary to learn about Emunah in a way which has to do with philosophical inquiry. What are the reasons which prevent us from having clear thought? Obviously, we're very distracted in our day and age. So besides not having been trained to think philosophically, we also don't have the menuchas hanefesh, the tranquility, the evenness of mind, where our mind doesn't get distracted or hung up on things to be able to study philosophy properly. Like the Rambam writes, because a person's mind is relatively short. Not every intellect can acquire truth in its proper way. And if people just follow in everything the thoughts of their hearts, a person will destroy the world based on the limits on his das. So in other words, we don't trust you to do philosophy. And then in Cyber Shem Agro, it's hold over the name of the Vilna Gaon. He didn't suggest to learn the Shar Yichud, which is the first Shar, which proves the existence of God through philosophy. He suggests to learn instead Sefer Kuzari. And this is because the Kuzari bases our Emunah not on philosophy, but on a historical tradition. And I don't remember this. Pinchas Lieberman, Mechaber Peirush Leib Tov Sefer Chavos HaBavos. he authored a commentary on the Chovos HaBavos. Asaf Harbe, he gathered many many words of crime, Hasholim as philosophers who reject using philosophy. And therefore, great sources wrote against the study of philosophy. The Rashba, Shuta Rivosh, Sefer Shloh, Yaakov Emden, Sefer Abris, Admor Mechaber Bnei Yisroschar, Sefer Der Pikudecha, the Bnei Yisroschar in his own Sefer Der Pikudecha, V'chein Admor Reb Nachman Breslau, Kutei Eitzos, V'chach came Shiur Shubas Chavas Shiur, with the 17th century posek, 17th, 18th century. Our generations do well. They distance themselves from the study of philosophy. It's best for us to believe the beliefs which are required of us, without any type of inquiry or questioning. Rambam Atzmo, and the Rambam himself, knew that the limitations people have in these inquiries. He warned about them. And in his introduction to the sefer Hanosei Koteres Tzavor, which bears the title will, as in last will and testament, he warned, Lo don't explain to anybody besides yourself. Unless it's something which is known not just from secular sources, but also from Torah sources. But that's what you understand from my sefer, which you don't know of a source in authentic Torah sources. So don't explain to other people, and don't burst out responding in these matters, because not everybody is suitable to learn these things. The Ramo didn't learn the bar limited it. He said, person should not, literally, the metaphor means to stroll in the orchard. The orchard means the orchard of philosophy. Only after you fill the stomach full of meat and wine, which is moments to know what's mutter, also what's mutter in mitzvahs and the laws of the mitzvahs. That's, he calls bas v'yayin. Ram himself warns us in Hilchot Yisrael Torah not to do this. So therefore, we're going to try, Bez Hashem, to some of the principles of Emunah based on philosophy, in an easier way to understand. No, it's not the more very complex ways that the Chovos HaBavos and the Nebuchim use, but in a simplified manner. Okay, so how do we start with a philosophical inquiry? Some of you starts trying to understand with his own intelligence what's going in the world. Shoel to me, his first question is, what happened before the world began? Trees come from seeds. And that seed came from a tree whose fruit fell to the ground. Okay, but who created the first tree? And if they answer you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Hashem created first tree, who created God, the first strength, the first power. There seems to be no end. In other words, the way the philosophers put it, every effect has a cause. And every cause is the effect of the preceding cause. So you have cause, effect. That effect comes the cause of the next effect. That effect comes the cause of the next effect, and so on and so forth. Because everything in this world is cause and effect. Something happens, that makes something else happen. And that something else makes another thing happen. So that's the case. Who started it? When did it start? What was the first cause? So Rambam's answer is the difference between something which is material, substance, and something which is not. Hagashmiyu bal chulas b'sisiyos. Something which has a physical, something which is physical, has specific characteristic traits. Kimo midos shetach, it has an area, takes up a certain area. Koved has a certain weight. Seva has a certain color. All these things are ways in which we perceive objects, things which are tangible, things which are, so to speak, real. Very cream, but these are called in philosophy. These are called coincidental. In other words, what color something is can change, right? I can change it from black to blue to green. What shape a person thing is can change. I can make it longer, shorter, wider, narrower. So these are all mikrim, these are all coincidences. I don't know if that's the best translation, but they're not something which is intrinsic, not something which is what defines the character of this thing. It's what this thing takes on a form as now. It's not the thing itself. Is not its length. It's not its width. It's not its weight. It's not its even its substance, as we shall see. Nosakach. Also, besides that, also davar gashmi humurkav. Things which exist in this world are complex. What do you mean by complex? So they all possess parts, which either come together or separate at very similar times. Even a rock, even a piece of metal, it's constantly changing. You just can't see it. But the atoms and the molecules are constantly moving and colliding and combining. There's lots of stuff going on. Nothing is at rest, actually, in this world. And nothing is just simple. It's all complex, and it's always in movement. Even a rock. To us, it looks like a rock is not moving. But the rock itself is full of movement inside. Atoms, molecules, electrons, protons, neutrons, everything is moving all the time. Right? So, Avodavar Bilti Gashmi. So it was not physical. And then about Mikrim. It doesn't have coincidences. In other words, it doesn't have changing characteristics over time. In Moshetach, it doesn't have an area. Koved, it doesn't have a weight. Seva, it doesn't have a color. V'chulei. It's also not made of parts. And therefore, it's not under the control of time. It should be this way one time and another way another time. So fascinating thing the philosophers would say, which is that anything which exists in time is complex, because you have to understand what it is at this point in time, whether it was the same at some prior point in time, where it's going to the future at another point in time, and where it's going to the same another point in time in the future. The time itself which passes over an object makes a difference. Why? Because something can be old, something can be new, and then become old. Young and then become old. So everything is always changing in a physical object. It's always in flux. You might not see it. You might not perceive it, but you know it is always in movement. It's always basically changing, even though you might not perceive the changes because they're so subtle and not on the surface, they're deep down and embedded, but it's always changing. Avdar business about Mikrim Ebo Shetach doesn't have area, Koved, weight, Seva, color, Chule, it's not made up of pieces of particles. If it's not controlled by time, anything in time can change. This is not subject to time. All of our rascals of this world who rock at it's only through physical objects. I can't see spirituality. I can sense spirituality. I can't see something which has no mass, no measure. I might be able to sense it, but I can't perceive it. But I can know that they're malach. I can even feel malachim perhaps, but I can't perceive them in a physical way because they're not subject to our physical dimensions, proportions, and processes. So every under Mashishima Summits will say that we feel physical things which are with our fingers, Modadim as osama de klimadiyah, we measure them with the tools which we have in our hands. On the materials of we describe the various different objects by physical things which are applicable to them, whether they're soft or hard, whether they are strong or weak, whether they are new or old, and so on and so forth. These are all descriptions of the physical aspect of anything in the world. And since all of us were born into this limited world, which is subject to the control of time and substance, you can't get out of that. Everything in this world exists in time and exists in substance. Yes, you have the neshama, perhaps, which transcends that, but in this world, everything is time and substance. Okay. We don't recognize directly things which are not material. Things which are not subject to time, and to changing their shape, their state, changing all the time. There's nothing which exists in the world which is not by coincidence. It's not just because it happened that way, but because it's some part of some divine master plan. Obviously, there are such things, but we don't know what things are when they're not physical. We only see things which are physical. We only hear things which are physical. We can only sense things which are physical. All 5 senses are only for things which are physical and exist in time and in place and in space. But when we use our logic, Neda will know she is the things which are not material. People know there was in this week's parsha. Yosher, honesty. Is honesty a thing? No, honesty is not a thing. It's a concept. Tzedek, justice. Is justice a thing? No, it's a concept. Kavod, honor, concept. If anything, these concepts are of much greater value than anything physical which we have, anything material. And they influence in much more powerful way. More than anything physical. In terms of their actual significance, they're the most important. Tzedek, Yosher, Simcha, Tov, all these things are very powerful and essential and core to our existence, even though you can't measure them, you can't taste them, you can't smell them, you can't see them. They're there, the reality. On the other hand, things which are material, they are by definition temporary. They'll pass, they'll be gone. They're not stable over time. The Rambam spends a long time discussing this in Mori. Now, before we go on to the next part, so the Rabbi Kaplan has a fascinating mashal for this. He says 2 + 2 = 4 is true, right? Although you can argue on that and make and philosophically prove perhaps that 2 + 2 = 5, but that's not the point. 2 + 2 = 4. It's a truth. It's a very strong truth. It's a fact. It's a very well-known fact. But it doesn't exist in space. Right? 2 + 2 = 4 is not true over here, not over there. It's not true at this time and not another time. Why? Because it's a concept, not limited. Same, which is a concept can be all over the place, so to speak. It's not limited in time, space, dimensions. It's always true. So we have objects which are limited, and we have concepts which are not limited. We have objects which are bound by time and space, and concepts which are not bound by time and space. Okay. Now it's clear that nothing can create itself. It's not possible that things create themselves for 3 reasons. Aleph, this is a very good philosophical question. Classic philosophical question. Why would you create yourself if you have no will to create yourself? The will to create creates. But if you have no will, then you can't create because you have no will to be creative. It's a cute cop, right? If you have nothing to create itself, because creation emerges from a will to create. But if you have no will, if you don't exist, you have no will to create. You have no will at all. You still have the will to create yourself. Based. Presumably, you need tools or create yourself. How are you going to acquire those tools if you need to create yourself? How did you get into creation? You didn't have the tools. So how do I expect to create something else without tools? So where are the tools in order for a person to create himself? You can't create, again, maybe create other people. You can't create yourself because you need tools. There's an interesting marshal for this thing. One says, who made the first pliers? Pliers require pliers to make them. So who made the first pliers? You can't make a pliers out of pliers. So the Gemara says the first pliers is made by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he gave it to mankind. And then mankind can do what everything pliers can do. So the idea is that you need to have pliers in order to make things. You need to have tools in order to create things. Where do you have those tools if you can't create yourself? They didn't pre-exist you. You're creating yourself. Now you have to create the tools, but it's too late. You already created yourself. So how did you get to that? How do you get past the stage of creating yourself without any tools? It's a cute, like I said, it's a cute idea. Gimel. This is in fancy Latin, we call it creation ex nihilo. Creation from nothing. So the idea is, how do you come from non-existence into existence? Right. The first question was, where do you have the will to create yourself? Now we're asking, how do you come? Okay, hypothetically, let's add a will to create yourself. Makes no sense. Let's say you did, right? But what kind of capacity do you have to take yourself from the realm of the will to the realm of actual tangible existence? Doesn't exist. There's no continuum. There's no way to get from one to the other, right? You have no koach ma'aseh. The only things human beings can do is create from something which exists, something else which exists. But we can't create out of nothingness, out of a void, the substance with which we need to create other stuff. So therefore, again, the question is, who made the first pliers? How do we get to the first step in creation? Right? If a man can't create himself, he has to be created. Who created man? There must have been a creator. Shein Laskol had no beginning. Anytime you have a beginning, the question emerges: how did you get what was before the beginning? Right? If there's a beginning, why begin there? What was before the beginning? If you find a new beginning, why begin there? There was the beginning before that, right? So there must be a creator who had no beginning. And that's the fascinating thing about Kosh Baruch Hu. Kosh Baruch Hu is very often called Ein Sof, the one who has no end. But it's also Ein Lo Tchila. He doesn't have a beginning. Because if he had a beginning, we'd have to ask, what was there before the beginning? But Hashem, by definition, has to be an entity that has no end and no beginning either. You guys following all this? Making sense so far? Anybody? Yes, no, maybe? Silence. No responses? Okay. So I guess we go on. The fact that we can't see God with our senses. And then also says it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The main thing is we can't see. We can't see our souls, but we have souls. So we can't really see electrons. You know, there are electrons. We can see the traces of electrons live, but we can't see electrons themselves. So the many things you can't see. The fact that we can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The fact that we can't see it. The creator can't see the creator with our senses, and says Mitsuso doesn't contradict his existence. Because his existence is necessary based on logic. There has to be a first cause which caused everything else to happen. And since we recognize that for him to be able to do that, it has to be perfection itself. If eventually the world is going to create perfection, come to perfection, then the creator has to be perfect. Because otherwise he couldn't create something which is going to come to perfection. So God is perfection, right? We know that this is true because we see and recognize his activities from his activities, the system of the nature, the one that sits in nature, and views which goes on consistently, from the beginning of the existence of humanity. There's no interruption. Hashem's perfection is such that nothing ever interrupts its perfection. Everything goes together. He certainly doesn't have substance which eventually decomposes over time. Nothing in this world exists forever. Even rocks, they decompose over time, right? So Kosh Baruch Hu doesn't decompose, right? So he must not be from the same type of material existence which we exist in. It's got to be something else. And again, it doesn't have this temporary, literally, this subject to loss, material existence. It changes all the time. He must be something which is separate, which is not material at all. That which can't see it, so that which your ear can't hear it. That's correct. But it's got to be that way. And it's very necessary for logical, to compel logic. Because in and of itself, how can those of us who are limited perceive that which is limitless? But our intellectual awareness that there's got to be a first cause, it transcends, goes beyond, and in fact serves as the introduction for any philosophical inquiry. That there's and again, it's our mind. We have to perceive, or rather, we do perceive. There's a first cause, so we know that there's a first cause. Otherwise, the whole system doesn't make any sense. And we certainly have to know that Hashem accomplished all these amazing things, so therefore we know He exists. Otherwise, Am Yisrael wouldn't exist, as He said several times already. This is analogous. It's similar to the raw tfias etzvos ezem mishtach. Somebody sees fingerprints on some surface. Yokai knows for sure there's somebody here. And left his sign here. So too from the temporary existence which passes, you can learn, okay, there must have been though an original creator who was physical, which doesn't change, and he is the ultimate perfection. Okay, so that is the assumption that must be a first cause. But how do we know there's only one first cause and that's two first causes? Made it two gods. Right? The answer to this is in spirituality, you can't distinguish between two things by a physical description. In other words, if you have 2 + 2 = 4, 2 + 2 = and 2 + 3 = 5. What differentiates between the two? Then they're both formulae. So they're both mathematics. What distinguishes the two of them is not something physical or tangible. It's because we we can define a difference, even though we can't experience that difference in a tangible way. As he says, Ruchnis answers of Dilman Shnaim Idation Natar is a Shinigash. You can't distinguish between two things by giving a physical difference. It's not necessarily different. It's difficult physically, it's not necessarily different spiritually. As soon like this, I have to define the difference between the two of them. By figuring out the difference in what these things excel, what makes these things special. Differentiating between two things that are spiritual can't take into account how they look, how big they are, where they're located, but rather what each thing is unique in. But the entity which created all these unique qualities, and which continues which continues to sustain itself without any cessation, without stopping, and without any stumbling. He Hashem is the most perfect of all things. Right? In other words, everything has its own perfection, so in which it excels over everything else. So the one who created them has to excel over all of these things, above and beyond everything, right? We can't. I skipped here, I think. If this, I skipped that important line. This thing is perfect, and it's there for the cause of everything. There can't be two perfections. By definition, you have two things. One of them is imperfect, right? If they both coexist, this one is not complete, and that one's not complete. They're both halves, right? It says by my husband and wife, the two halves, right? They work together, but one is not complete without the other. So too, if you're going to say that they're two creators, no, Reuven and Shimon, God, Reuven and God, Shimon, neither of them is complete. Neither is perfect. Each one has a limitation imposed by the existence of the others. Even though it's not a physical limitation, it's a spiritual limitation. They're not complete. There's missing something, each one. Right? We're not looking at physical distinctions. So how can there be more than one? How can you recognize more than one? If they're both identical in what they can do, and both identical there in what they do, they're one thing. So if I can have two pens, right? And even though they look the same, these don't. Even though they look the same, they're two different objects. This one takes up this space, this one takes up that space. This one exists in this material, this one exists in that material. But if God doesn't have any physical attributes, what's the difference between God and anything else? What's it between one neshama and another neshama? What's between the malach and the malach? They're spiritual purposes, right? So that if you have two things that have identical spiritual purposes, identical spiritual powers, identical spiritual capacities, they're the same thing. They're not two different things. It's impossible to have two things which are precisely the same in spirituality. In a physical realm, you can't. They're separate because they're going to be set by time and space. But in an area which there isn't time and space, you won't have that capacity, right? We can't make physical distinctions in this non-physical world. How do you know that they're more than one? You can't see one is more perfect than the other. Because then you have to assume that one of them is not so complete. We say each one is complete, perfect unto himself. Well, furthermore, in the world of recognition, we start from the point of zero. We don't know anything. By then compelling ourselves logically, we prove there's something which exists. One thing. But it's called Occam's razor. You never assume more than necessary. So our first assumption would be that there's one, not two. Why would you assume two if one is good enough? Don't add anything, right? And there's some compelling logic for that. Most time, let's see much around, not just to think, to suggest something, what you think about. Okay, less than a minute left. So I don't think we're going to be able to finish this section. We're basically finished. We'll finish it next time. But basically, we've seen philosophy means and how philosophy works and how it proves that there is a God by looking at the idea of first cause. Okay, so we'll stop here for tonight, and we'll finish up with this paragraph next week in Mitzvah Hashem. Have a good night.